China, the most populous country in the world, could lose this title next year and begin to experience a demographic collapse a decade earlier than expected, jeopardizing its economy, while the country is experiencing protests and the bursting of a real estate bubble that leaves Xi Jinping with very little room for error in order to maintain the stability of the world's second largest economy, causing the Communist Party to start taking desperate measures. But it could already be too late. Before starting, it's good to make a couple of concepts clear. The first of these is the population pyramid, a distribution of people according to their age and gender that, although historically it has looked like a pyramid, has begun to change and invert itself, increasingly concentrating on the older ages. This is a normal effect of industrialization. People move from the countryside to the cities, and women enter into the labor force. This causes couples to have fewer or even no children. And when the fertility rate, or the average number of births per woman throughout her life, falls below 2.1, then the population pyramid begins to deteriorate. This value is known as replacement fertility rate and is the number of children that an average couple should have, so that the population pyramid does not deteriorate, with 0.1 covering deaths and couples who decide not to have children. And when the fertility rate falls below this value, it necessarily implies that the population is aging and starting a trend that could be difficult and slow to reverse. When the older population increases, the dependency ratio increases, and the number of older adults and children who depend on people of working age to support them increases. This means less money is available to people of working age to save and invest, with strong implications for the economy, as I'll show you in a moment. And what was at first a new problem for humanity, visible mainly through Japan's stagnant economy, the burden of its long-lived population and the lack of young workers, is worse in China, where the fertility rate has fallen by below 1.15, while that of Japan is 1.3, and by 2021 it is estimated that China's population only grew 0.34%, and by 2022 it will decrease for the first time in 60 years and continue this trend for the next decades. But how did China get to this point several years earlier than estimated? In 1980, Deng Xiaoping implemented the one-child law in China, where with few exceptions, families were allowed to have only one child. This measure was taken with the aim of giving stability to the country, which had experienced a famine only 2 decades earlier and had a fertility rate of 2.6, which made it extremely complex to sustain the country without falling back into hunger, protests against the Communist Party, and economic decline. However, the Chinese Communist Party did not predict the long-term effects that this measure would have, and when it began to see its devastating effects, it was already too late. In 2016, the one-child policy was abolished and families were allowed 2 children. In 2021, 3 children began to be allowed, with neither of the 2 measures taking effect because the one-child policy caused structural damage to its population pyramid. Families preferred to have men for cultural reasons and to work in the fields, which is why many families made the decision to abort when the babies were girls. This over several decades caused a huge disparity between men and women that makes it much more difficult for men to find a partner to have a family. This, added to the migration from the countryside to the cities and the industrialization of China, has been causing the birth rate to drop rapidly. And although it had been estimated that the population of China would begin to shrink in 2029 according to the China Academy of Social Sciences, or in 2032 according to the UN, now the estimates have accelerated radically, and it is expected that this year the population will begin to decline, with the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences estimating that the population of China will have 587 million people in 2100, only 40% of the current population, and it will occur with a decrease of approximately 1.1% annually. Other, more pessimistic estimates forecast that the population will be cut in half by 2050, since the official figures could be very different from the real ones. Because of corruption, many times local governments inflate their population figures to receive more money for education from the central government, a type of corruption that of course is not exclusive to China.
As of January of 2020, China was the fastest aging society in human history. The one-child policy had been in place for so long, the whole place was facing demographic collapse. The question was, how soon? Now, in 2020, playing the numbers forward, the best guess was that by the year 2100, that the Chinese would have less than half the population that they have today. So from 1.4 billion down to 700 million. But then the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces from their census. And that date, 2100, got moved bit by bit forward until by the time we got to October, they were thinking they were going to be at that 50% point by 2050, just 30 years from now. For that to be true, China's real population structure has to look a lot more like this. It appears that the Chinese have overcounted their population by an excess of 100 million people. And with most of the overcounts for people who were born during the one-child period, people who are under 35, the people who could possibly theoretically generate a replacement generation. And considering how chauvinist Chinese culture is, the vast majority of the overcounts are probably women. Which means that China's population didn't peak in 2019 like they were thinking. It probably peaked in 2004.
But why is it so relevant at an economic level? According to researchers Fang Kai and Yang Lu, 24% of China's economic growth in the period 1978 to 2010 was due to the population growth and low dependency rate. In other words, what caused about a quarter of the growth of the country was population growth and the rate at which this growth occurred. Since most families were limited to having one child, the dependency ratio was low and they were able to save more and accumulate more capital to invest. Both factors, which were positive for China's growth in that period, have started to turn negative. Initially, due to the drop in the working age population and the increase in retired people, which increased the dependency ratio, and now, because the population has begun to decrease. This is China's official growth in the last 6 decades, averaged over 5 years to smooth the data. And this is China's average economic growth per person in those years. As you can see, it is less than the total growth of the economy. By simple arithmetic, the total growth of the economy will be given by the growth of the population and the economic growth of each person in that population. The problem is that now that the population has started to decline, then the economic growth per person will be greater than the total growth of the economy. In fact, we can make an estimate by taking the estimated population decline from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and the average of economic growth per person, which as you can see has been falling, and this would give us that even if China manages to maintain economic growth per person of 5.6%, due to population decline, its economy would grow 4.5%. This is, of course, just an estimate to illustrate the direct effect of population decline as an adverse effect on the growth of the economy, but it leaves several ideas aside, which could make this scenario worse than it really is. First of all, because it is not just the population, it is the dependency ratio, which could reach 100% as soon as 2040. That is, each child or retired adult, especially retired adults, will depend on a single worker. Something that if it is not solved and something extraordinary happens at the technological level would imply the collapse of China as we know it, perhaps sooner if the demographic figures continue to deteriorate. Because much of China's growth, as Fang Kai and Yang Lu found, was due to the decrease in the dependency age, which allowed people to invest more, but since 2010 when the dependency ratio started to rise after falling over several decades, growth also began to decline. And secondly, hand in hand with the previous point, because it takes a high level of growth as a reference, which has been declining and which faces many problems that I will comment on in a moment, and that could cause production per person to grow much less than what is proposed here. Third, it assumes that the official data is true, but the population might actually be smaller. Before continuing and telling you about the measures that the Chinese Communist Party has begun to implement, remember to subscribe and share this video if you have found this information useful. The first measure implemented by the Chinese government was obviously the one taken in 2016 when it abolished the one-child law to move to the two-child policy, which was changed to a three-child policy in 2021. In addition, China has been giving incentives to families to have more children, such as access to preferential housing, better maternity leave. It is trying to discourage abortions that are not strictly necessary and increase access to fertility treatments, among others. And during 2021, it prohibited online education companies from generating profits as a way to pressure them to lower prices and make it less expensive for families to educate their children and avoid the education cost as a disincentive to have them. China has also been discouraging the use of houses as an investment, and in August 2020, with the entry of the Three Red Lines, it sought to stop the accelerated real estate growth that, although it was responsible for much of the growth and development of China, was causing a bubble in the sector that made it very difficult for singles to buy a house in order to get married and have a family.
Anger erupting among Chinese home buyers as property developers hold construction on their homes.
这种希望破灭的那种感觉，就有点万念俱灰了。
Both measures came at an enormous cost, discouraging investment in the country, generating international mistrust in the Xi Jinping government, and with the bankruptcy of several developers, the beginning of protests by families who had not received their houses and now refused to pay the banks the loans, among others. If the results exceed the costs, it will be something that will only be seen in the long term. And to prepare for that long term, China has also begun a pension reform to make sure it can support the elderly when they reach old age. In a very summarized way, the pension system in China works as follows. The main pillar is based on the intergenerational solidity model, where the pensions of retired people are covered from taxes on workers' earnings. The second pillar, much scarcer, occurs when the employee and employer agree to allocate a portion of the salary to savings for the pension. And the third pillar, which is the one that China has been promoting, is the private pension system, where the person saves money that is invested in the financial markets to take advantage of compound interest and use its savings when the person retires. The pension age, which is 60 for men, 55 or 50 for women depending on the type of work they do, will also start to rise to slow the growth in the dependency ratio. China has also been following in the footsteps of Singapore, Korea, and Japan and increasing investment in automation as part of its Made in China 2025 plan, with which it seeks to move from a cheap labor-intensive industry to one based on cutting-edge technology, to mitigate the decline in the number of people of working age. And by 2020, it was already the 9th country in robotics density in the world, an indicator used to measure the level of automation in the industry. In addition to being the second country in investments in artificial intelligence after the United States. These measures, although they can somewhat mitigate the effect of population decline, also have some obstacles. The first of these is that reversing population decline is not only not an easy task, but rather a slow one. Even if a solution is found today, the working age population, which is the primary one to consider for economic purposes, would not start to increase for a couple of decades for unskilled labor and longer still for skilled labor. The second obstacle is that China, despite its growth, is a country with a negative net migration rate and more people leave the country than enter. And the restrictive measures taken by the government, even if it is assumed that they work to encourage people to have children, also discourage the arrival of people from other countries and make local human talent consider migrating, as is reflected in this negative rate. And hand in hand with this, there is the third obstacle, which is the difficult situation that young people live in China, where the culture of the so-called 996 makes young people feel strong pressure to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, leaving extremely limited time to interact with other people and even consider starting a family. For this reason, it is not a surprise that many decide to migrate to other countries in search of a different lifestyle. And fourthly, there is the disagreement with the government, which has caused dozens of protests in different cities of the country due to the zero-COVID policies that the Chinese Communist Party has been implementing and that have caused quarantines in Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, Shenzhen, among others, when only a few cases appear. This has increased the discontent of people who have been in intermittent quarantines since the pandemic began in 2020 and more than a year after most of the world emerged from it. And although the strict quarantines worked very well at the beginning of the pandemic, with the current variants they are not doing it, and that is why it is not clear when the economy will reopen fully and what could happen once that reopening and an expansion of the virus occurs. But for the moment it is causing enormous discontent among people, further limiting interactions between them and reinforcing incentives for people who can leave the country, especially young people of working age, who according to different studies are more willing to migrate than the older population. And China, which is the second largest economy in the world, the largest exporter and second largest importer, will leave a huge hole in the world's growth, affecting to a greater or lesser extent all those who trade with this country. And you, how do you think that China and other countries that are going through this situation will be able to solve this problem? I would like to know your opinion. See you next time.